Picture this: a detective in a rumpled raincoat, chewing on a cheap cigar, pulling up to a mansion in a car so battered, so unglamorous, that the millionaire suspect inside can barely hide his contempt. That detective is Columbo, and that car, faded, dented, endlessly reliable, is a Peugeot, not a random prop somebody grabbed off a studio lot. That specific car became one of the most recognizable vehicles in television history, and almost nobody realizes it's connected to one of the biggest sales stories in French automotive history. This is the story of the Peugeot 403. And by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly why a car nobody expected to matter ended up selling over 1 million units, and why it's still remembered today, decades after the last one rolled off the line. Let's rewind. Early 1950s. Peugeot is a respected name, sure, but a cautious one, a company that plays it safe, that doesn't take unnecessary risks. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody at the company wanted to say out loud. Since 1948, Peugeot had been leaning on a single model, the 203, to carry the entire weight of the brand. One car, that's it, no backup plan, no second option, waiting in the wings if buyers moved on. In a rapidly modernizing post-war Europe, that's not a strategy, that's a gamble the company genuinely couldn't afford to keep making. Rival manufacturers were already moving forward without them. Alfa Romeo had recently introduced a fresh, 3-volume sedan design with fully integrated fenders, a completely different silhouette from the boxy, old-fashioned shapes that had dominated the previous decade of European car design. Peugeot's leadership understood the uncomfortable reality staring back at them. Stand still, and you get left behind. And getting left behind, for a company with only one model on the market, could mean something far worse than falling sales. So in 1950, Peugeot quietly began developing something new. And here's where the first real surprise in this story comes in. Instead of keeping the design entirely in-house, the way French manufacturers had traditionally done for decades, Peugeot made a decision that would reshape the company for the next half-century. They brought in an outside design house, from Italy, a studio called Pininfarina. Think about how unusual that was at the time, a proud, established French manufacturer handing over the shape of its next major car to a design studio based in Turin, Italy. It wasn't just a stylistic choice made to chase a trend. It was Peugeot quietly admitting that they needed outside eyes, outside instincts, to genuinely compete on a changing continent. And this decision didn't just produce one good-looking car and end there. It launched a partnership between Peugeot and Pininfarina that would continue, uninterrupted, for more than 50 years afterward, shaping the look of Peugeots for generations of drivers who never knew where that relationship actually began. But here's the detail almost nobody talks about, the kind of thing that only surfaces when you dig into local records from Sochaux, the small French town where Peugeot's main factory sat. Months before the car was officially revealed to the public, prototypes of the 403, badges removed, no nameplates, nothing to identify them, were quietly driven on ordinary public roads near the factory. Real test drivers, in real everyday traffic, pushing the car through real conditions instead of a closed track. And here's the part that's almost funny when you sit with it. The locals in Sochaux saw these unmarked cars so often, day after day, that they simply stopped noticing them entirely. To the townspeople, it was just another car on the road, nothing worth a second glance. But word of these mysterious test cars got out to the automotive press in Paris, and suddenly, journalists were making the trip specifically to a small town that otherwise never made national headlines, all just to catch a glimpse of Peugeot's next car before anyone was ever supposed to see it. To build this car properly, Peugeot didn't just design something new on paper, they physically rebuilt their entire production capability from the ground up. The Sochaux plant, which had handled the 203 for years, needed serious new space to handle what was coming. Peugeot acquired an additional 30,000 square meters of land specifically for this project. 18,000 of that went toward body production alone. 10,000 more was dedicated to painting and interior fitting. and a final 2,000 square meters was set aside purely for manufacturing specific components the car would need. This wasn't a modest facelift bolted onto an old model. This was Peugeot quietly rebuilding its entire manufacturing backbone around a single new car, betting the company's near future on it. Now, before we get to how this car actually performed once it hit the road, if you're enjoying this deep dive into a piece of automotive history most people never properly learned, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to dig up the real stories behind the machines that shaped the 20th century. Properly researched, no guesswork, no invented details. And if something in this video catches you off guard, put it in the comments below. I read every single one of them. The Peugeot 403 was officially unveiled on the 20th of April, 1955, at the Trocadero Palace in Paris. Not a quiet press release tucked into a trade magazine. A genuine public event, staged in one of the most recognizable locations in the entire city, in front of a public that had been quietly hearing rumors about this car for months. And this car carried weight far beyond its own name. It was the very first Peugeot the company had ever built, specifically with large-scale export in mind. Up until this point, Peugeot had largely remained a domestic story, a French car for French drivers. The 403 was designed, from the ground up, to change that completely. Now here's where the engineering side of this story gets genuinely interesting. Because Peugeot made a bet that most manufacturers of the era considered far too risky for an ordinary family sedan. The 403 became the first mass-produced French car ever offered with a diesel engine option. Sit with that for a second. In the mid-1950s, diesel technology existed almost exclusively in trucks, industrial vehicles, and heavy machinery. Nobody serious was putting it into a family car meant for everyday driving, school runs, and weekend trips. It felt experimental, almost eccentric for a mainstream manufacturer. Peugeot did it anyway. And that decision wasn't just about being different for the sake of standing out. Diesel engines, even in their early unrefined form, offered something ordinary buyers desperately wanted in post-war Europe. Genuine fuel economy and mechanical durability that gasoline engines of the era simply couldn't match. Peugeot was quietly betting that practical, hard-working families would value a car that sipped fuel and kept running for years over one that offered flashy, short-lived performance. It was a quiet bet, made without much fanfare. But it turned out to be exactly the right one. The car came in far more forms than most people realize today, decades removed from when it was actually on sale. Not just the standard four-door saloon that most people picture. Peugeot built it as a station wagon, marketed as the commerciale for families and tradesmen who needed the extra room. As a genuine two-door convertible, produced only in relatively small numbers, roughly 2,000 units across its run, which is part of why an original example still commands serious money at classic car auctions today. Even as a small pickup truck and a dedicated delivery van, built for exactly the kind of unglamorous daily work that never makes it into a glossy sales brochure. One single platform, stretched across an entire family's worth of different needs, from the businessman driving to the office each morning, to the tradesman hauling equipment across town every afternoon. And the scale of production tells its own story, one that speaks louder than any advertisement Peugeot ever ran. Between 1955 and 1966, Peugeot built more than 1,214,000 of these vehicles, counting every single version combined. To put that number in perspective, this was the very first Peugeot model in the company's entire history to cross the 1 million unit mark, not the flashiest car they'd ever made. Not the fastest, not the most talked about at the time. The one that quietly, steadily, proved itself to over 1 million separate families, businesses, and drivers across more than a decade of continuous production. And it wasn't just a French success story confined to European roads either. The 403 was actually assembled overseas too, in factories built specifically to produce it, in Melbourne, Australia, in Berazategui, Argentina, in Otahuhu, New Zealand, and in Montevideo, Uruguay. A car developed in a small French factory town ended up being physically built on 4 separate continents, adapted to local markets that had never even heard of Sochaux. That's not just popularity. That's genuine, earned global trust in a machine that never once tried to be flashy in the first place. Even the small technical refinements Peugeot made over the years tell the same quiet story of steady, careful improvement rather than dramatic reinvention. In 1959, engineers repositioned the windscreen washer nozzles, moving them from the strip of metal beneath the windscreen to the rear edge of the hood itself, simply to improve the angle at which the water actually hit the glass. That same year, the old half-circle horn ring inside the steering wheel was replaced with a full circular design, so drivers accustomed to holding the upper half of the wheel no longer had to loosen their grip just to sound the horn. Small things. But small things that add up to a company genuinely listening to how real people use the car every single day. But sales figures and factory locations, as impressive as they genuinely are, don't fully explain why this particular car ended up burned into the memory of an entire generation. For that, we need to talk about a fictional detective in a permanently wrinkled raincoat. In 1968, a television series premiered that would run in various forms across 2 different networks, all the way through 2003. The show was Columbo, starring Peter Falk as a scruffy, unassuming Los Angeles homicide detective who solved cases by quietly, patiently outsmarting wealthy, arrogant murderers who never once saw him coming. And the car Columbo drove, week after week, episode after episode, across more than 60 appearances, was a 1959 Peugeot 403 Cabriolet. Here's the detail that makes this genuinely remarkable. That car wasn't chosen by some studio executive flipping casually through a catalogue of available vehicles. Peter Falk himself personally selected it, after spotting the very car sitting, almost forgotten, in a parking lot at Universal Studios. He saw it, and he apparently knew immediately that this was Columbo's car, the one piece of set dressing that would define the character before he ever said a single line of dialogue. And Falk understood something the network probably didn't fully appreciate at first. The choice of vehicle wasn't just practical set dressing, it was character, woven directly into every scene. Every suspect Columbo investigated was wealthy. Every one of them drove something sleek, expensive, dripping with status. In more than one episode, the actual on-screen villains drove Ferraris, gleaming and immaculate. And there's Columbo, rolling up in a faded, dented, mechanically unreliable French convertible that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard, not parked outside a Beverly Hills mansion. Now here's the part that turns this from a fun piece of trivia into something genuinely revealing about the car itself. That Peugeot wasn't simply left looking old for the cameras and forgotten about. The production team deliberately let it look worse and worse as the series went on, year after year. It was written into the show as a running joke, a car that constantly broke down at the worst possible moments, that suspects openly mocked to Columbo's face, that seemed to embarrass him in front of people who assumed status was everything worth having. And across the show's long run, that same car, or vehicles standing in for it, was actually damaged as part of the plot in at least 4 separate episodes, crashed into, banged up. Treated like a disposable joke by wealthy characters who assumed a detective who couldn't afford a decent car couldn't possibly outthink them either. They were always wrong. And that's exactly the point the show kept making, episode after episode, year after year. Think about what that car was actually doing, symbolically, every single week on national television. It was standing in for the same idea Peugeot had quietly built into the real 403 back in 1955, substance over show, reliability over flash. A car, and a detective, that nobody took seriously right up until the moment they proved everyone in the room wrong. That's not a coincidence you can manufacture after the fact, no matter how good the writers were. That's the genuine reputation the 403 had already earned in the real world, on real roads, with real families, years before Columbo ever climbed behind its wheel. Falk didn't pick a flashy car and dress it down for the cameras. He picked a car that already represented exactly what his character needed to represent: understated, unglamorous, and quietly capable of outlasting anything the wealthy competition was driving that week. And that popularity created a strange kind of afterlife for the car, long after the cameras stopped rolling. Decades after Colombo went off the air, die-cast model versions of that exact cabriolet were still being produced and sold to collectors. People who never even lived through the show's original broadcast, but still recognized the silhouette instantly, from a single glance. A car built to be practical family transportation in the 1950s had become, without anyone at Peugeot ever planning it, a genuine piece of television iconography. Meanwhile, back in the real automotive world, the 403 kept doing exactly what it had always done, working, day after day, without complaint. It stayed in production far longer than anyone at Peugeot had originally expected. Its official successor, the 404, launched in 1960, sleeker, more aerodynamic, more technically advanced in almost every measurable way an engineer could point to. And yet the 403 didn't simply disappear the moment its replacement arrived in showrooms. Saloon and cabriolet production finally ended in 1966, a full 6 years after the newer model was already on sale beside it. The commercial and diesel versions kept going for roughly another year after that, still finding buyers who trusted the older design. By this point, newer, more modern rivals were emerging across the industry, cars like the Ford Cortina, sharper, more contemporary, clearly built for a new decade. And the 403, despite its steady stream of small improvements, was undeniably beginning to show its age next to them. Think about what all of this actually means, taken together. A car considered outdated by its own manufacturer's newer lineup kept selling, kept getting built, kept earning trust from buyers who simply didn't care that something newer existed in the showroom right next door. That's not stubbornness on Peugeot's part. That's a company recognizing, correctly, that the 403 had built something a newer model simply can't manufacture overnight, no matter how good its engineering, a genuine, earned reputation for being dependable, exactly when it mattered most. By the time production finally stopped, the 403 had done something no previous Peugeot had ever managed. It had become the company's first true post-war million seller, quietly earning the affectionate French nickname Le Gentleman along the way. A car respected not for flair, but for its steady, dependable decency. And in doing so, it laid the exact groundwork that would eventually make later legendary Peugeot models, cars that would go on to define the brand for entire generations afterward, commercially possible in the first place. So here's the truth sitting underneath this entire story. The 403 was never the fastest car of its era. It was never the most glamorous, never the one turning heads at a stoplight the way a Ferrari or a Jaguar might have. It was designed by an outside studio because Peugeot admitted, honestly, that they needed help. It was tested in disguise on ordinary public roads because there was no budget and no need for pretending otherwise. It was mocked, on national television, by wealthy fictional villains who never once suspected the man driving it. And it still outsold, outlasted, and outworked nearly everything else Peugeot had ever built before it. That's the real lesson here, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Reliability doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't need to. It just keeps showing up, week after week, decade after decade, until one day you look back and realize it quietly became the foundation everything else was built on. Whether that's a car, a detective's reputation, or your own life's work, the flashy version rarely wins in the end. The dependable one usually does. If this story brought back a memory for you, whether it was seeing one of these on the road as a kid, or watching Colombo outsmart another arrogant suspect from the driver's seat of that battered convertible, do something for me. Hit subscribe, because there are plenty more stories like this one waiting to be told properly, with real research behind every single detail. Drop a comment and tell me what stuck with you most: the diesel gamble, the disguised prototypes rolling quietly through Sochaux, or Colombo's beat-up cabriolet outsmarting every Ferrari on the show. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, And if you know someone who'd appreciate a story like this, share it with them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.